We conducted a poll about forced arbitration with a representative cross-section of 1,200 Americans who were registered to vote. The interviews were conducted in the second half of January. The sample, just so you know, is about 5 points Democratic. But as you'll hear, the partisanship of the sample is not particularly important because support for ending forced arbitration crosses party lines and is broadly shared across the public. Let me just make a few of the key points about what we learned from the survey. The first point is that Americans who would find themselves in a similar situation don't want to be forced into arbitration. We asked people if they believe they had been harmed by a company's negligence, either physically or financially. Would they prefer to have their claims decided by a judge and jury or through arbitration? And by 2 to 1, Americans say, in those circumstances, I want to have the right to have my claims heard by a judge and jury. Underlying that is an understanding or recognition that many Americans have that the system of forced compulsory arbitration is a rigged system. They recognize that it does not exist for the benefit of consumers or employees, but for the benefit of corporations. In fact, when we ask people who mainly benefits from this system of arbitration rather than allowing people to take their claims to court, by a margin of close to 9 to 1, people say this is a system that benefits, mainly benefits corporations as opposed to mainly benefiting consumers and employees. You can see in the chart behind me, maybe you can see, that we asked voters about 2 different circumstances, what they think ought to happen or what's the better way to deal with claims by consumers. First, when there are claims by consumers against companies, is it better to require the use of arbitration for all claims, as many companies do, or better to give consumers a choice of using arbitration or the courts for each claim? And you can, for those consumer claims, by a margin of 84 to 16, Americans say it is better to give the choice to the consumer and not to allow corporations to mandate arbitration. In terms of employment claims, when people are asked about the better way to deal with claims by employees against employers, by 81 to 19, they say it is better to give employees the choice of using arbitration or the courts for their claims, rather than allowing companies to require and mandate compulsory arbitration. When we ask about this principle in terms of legislation, on the next chart, you can see that there is overwhelming support for the legislation that would accomplish what the FAIR Act would do. When we talk about a bill that says companies cannot require the use of arbitration when a consumer or employee has a dispute or a claim, and that under this legislation, consumers and employees would have the choice of taking their claim to court or submitting it to arbitration, 84% of Americans, registered voters, say that they would support this legislation, and only 11% say they would oppose it. I mentioned the strong bipartisan nature of the response here, and you can see this on the chart. Among Democratic voters, by 83 to 12, they favor the FAIR Act. Among independent voters, by 80 to 11, they favor the FAIR Act. And among Republican voters, by 87 to 9, an even greater margin than among Democrats, they favor the FAIR Act. Among Americans who told us they voted for President Trump in the 2016 election, by 86 to 9, they favor this legislation. And even if you look at the most conservative Republican voters, by 89 to 7, they support the legislation. So the short answer is the American people are with you. In fact, as part of this, our research, we were able to tell our respondents' story is very much like yours. And it's not, their hearts are with you and their votes are with you. When they think that what the kinds of treatment that each of you suffered and that others like you did is unfair and unjust, and they want Congress to remedy it. Let me just close by talking about three things in particular that Americans overwhelmingly find egregiously wrong with the forced arbitration system. The first is that arbitration procedures keep corporations' negligence and bad behavior secret. And for example, employees will not learn that a supervisor had sexually harassed female employees. 73% say that that's a very serious concern about the arbitration system. Related to the secrecy of the system, forced arbitration puts public health and safety at risk. If corporations know they can't be held accountable in court, the cars we drive, the medicines we take, and the foods we eat will be less safe. 73% find that to be a very serious concern about mandatory arbitration. And then finally, that forced arbitration prohibits consumers, employees from suing a company, even in the case where a company broke a federal or state law against discrimination based on gender, race, age, or disability. Again, 73% of Americans say that that is a very serious problem with forced arbitration. So the bottom line is Americans get it. They get that this is a system that is rigged, that is not fair to the average worker and the average consumer, and they stand behind the effort you heard about today for Congress to take action to remedy this and end forced arbitration in our country. Thank you.